Okay, so we've decided the exam is not this Friday, but next Friday, which is September 29th, in the classroom here. And I'll get back to you on the room scheduling of when I can actually get here. I usually try to get here 20 minutes to the hour and stay 20 minutes after the hour, but we'll see if we can pull that off that Friday. And then the review session on Monday, this coming Monday. Okay, so hopefully you did get a chance to see some mosses in lab yesterday. Really marvelous little plants that mainly, when you think about all these bryophytes, because they don't have that vascular system, that's one huge reason why they're so petite, small. And they tend to reflect the environment around them in the sense that if the environment is nice and humid and moist, then they are too. If the environment is very dry, then they are too. And so that's why in drier habitats, you'll see mosses that look dead or really dried out. But once the humidity comes up, the rain comes, they can reactivate to large extent. So mosses, liverworts, and hornworts are the bryophytes. We talked about them on Monday, that they don't really have true leaves or roots. They don't have vascular tissue. They just got to absorb what they need from their environment through rain and fog and dust particles, and that they need free water for fertilization, for the sperm to be able to get to the egg. So we've gone through all of this, and I wanted to cover a little bit more on the bryophytes. We kind of just introduced them on Monday, but we looked at how they can be, kind of cushiony versus feathery in terms of their overall appearance, and that they form spores as part of their life cycle that they will eventually release out into the environment to hopefully those spores will land somewhere, germinate, grow into new bryophytes. And so I think we stopped on kind of looking here with the very wonderful picture there of water droplets in the sporangium tissue at the tip here, where that will come open, eventually break open and release the spores. I did want to talk to you a little bit about some of their ecology and uses. And so they are found in places that vascular plants just can't survive, because the bryophytes don't have roots. They don't have to mine the soil for water and minerals. So they can grow all over the place, where vascular plants that have roots can't do it. And so whether it's, you think about rooftops, I have moss on my shingles right now that I need to deal with. Just all kinds of areas that you can think of where you can find them, and vascular plants would be able to manage to grow in those environments. So far, we haven't seen any in marine systems in the ocean. There's certainly some in freshwater. And if you go into more extreme habitats, they tend to outnumber the vascular plants, which is interesting. But they tend to be able to survive and go into long dormancy when needed, and then revive and come back and be active after the hostile environmental conditions have calmed down a bit. And so they can be very impressive in the more hostile environment, the environments we consider to be hostile. And so they can tolerate really consistently dark conditions at the poles, freezing conditions. It's also important that you realize that they got help. So the bryophytes are the most primitive land plants, and they did receive help. We hypothesize all those millions of years ago, when they were getting more established on terrestrial environments, that the mycorrhizal fungi were there for them to help them establish. And so the mycorrhizal fungi, again, they were pivotal to get that transition from the marine environment, the watery environment, to terrestrial environment. They're very good at coming into disturbed habitats. So they can come into fire-prone areas. They're very good at colonizing rock material that's bare. They can be one of the first organisms there. Lichen, by the way, lichen, which we haven't really talked about in this class, but they also are very good at colonizing fresh habitats, bare rock. And similar to the lichen, they're actually fairly sensitive to pollution. So if you're out hiking around and you see a lot of bryophytes and mosses in particular, that's usually a really good sign that you're in an area that has fairly healthy air quality. They seem to be particularly sensitive to sulfur dioxide. And they also, they can accumulate heavy metals just because of, how they absorb minerals. They just absorb everything. And so well, not everything, but they can absorb certainly an overdose of zinc and lead due to our pollution events that we've done. And so again, if you have to think about that when you look around and you're hiking around. We have a lot of bryophytes around here. They're actually studying some bryophytes that are very good at surviving desert conditions and growing in desert conditions when there's enough moisture to actually grow. And then they can go into long-term like stasis or dormancy. And so they're trying to figure that out because they want to potentially genetically engineer crop plants with the genes that allow these plants to do this so well. And so they're studying these different mosses. The big one right now is this species, which you don't even know the name of it, but you're curious. It's Tortula borealis, and it's a moss that is incredibly good. So that's what you're looking at in these two images. The bottom image is when it's dehydrated, it's dried out, and then when it gets exposed to moisture and water, it greens out pretty quickly. And so they're trying to figure all this out and maybe use that information to engineer crop plants that can survive similar drought conditions. On the another one that's super important commercially is sphagnum peat moss, and this one is found in peat bogs. We have peat bogs around here in this area of the world. Many of them, if you've ever taken any of Dr. Robertus's field botany classes, I'm sure you've gone to a peat bog. They're super acidic. Relative to most other mosses, sphagnum moss grows pretty quickly. And some experts say about greater than a little over 1% of the Earth's surface, but we're talking the entire Earth. So that's actually quite a lot. This last point, you might want to put a question mark where it says source of renewable energy. Depends who you talk to. Some people say absolutely not. We should not be using them for energy sources. And other people say if you do it the right way, it's renewable. So I think it's a matter of how much you take per year and whether or not it's actually renewable. And so they do kind of harvest peat moss in the northern latitudes, different countries, Canada, Ireland, for example, Scotland, I think as well. And when you read some of their experts, they say it is renewable, but many other scientists would disagree with that. Why is it being harvested and used? It's because it has so many valuable uses commercially. So it's referred to as a soil conditioner. Pretty much any potting soil bag that you buy these days has peat moss mixed in. Just look on the ingredient list. They usually put it as one of the marketing strategies right on the bag. It's highly advertised that it contains peat moss. So it has the ability, this right picture here is looking at it under the microscope. All those clear cells, those are just cells that absorb water. So it's just sucking up water and holding onto it. So when you add peat moss into soil and then you water that soil, the peat moss soaks up a lot of that water and then slowly releases it out to the soil. So that's why they say you don't have to water as much if you use potting soil that have peat moss. It also has other properties that are very attractive. It is known to produce acids and antiseptic, so it's antimicrobial. And so it's good for reducing plant pathogens in your soil. People have used that historically for diapers, lining diapers, like if you had a cloth diaper and you line that with peat moss, then the baby, excretes urine, especially, it would soak up that urine and keep the baby's skin nice and healthy. They've used it historically to stuff furniture. During World War I, it was a big deal. It was kind of serendipitous. They ran out of bandages, and some of the nurses grabbed some peat moss from the local like boggy area where they were treating wounded soldiers on the front lines, and one of the nurses knew a little bit about ethnobotany. Anyway, started using that to dress wounds, skin, open wounds on the body, and they quickly realized how well the wounds healed with the sphagnum moss, better than just bandages, especially if it was just bandages, no other type of antiseptic. And so that was a big deal when that discovery was made. They've used it for oil spills that have occurred because it's so good, again, at absorbing, that it would absorb up the oil, and then they could harvest, get the peat moss out of there and take it away. And then currently they still, I think, use it pretty often for shipping shellfish for food consumption, to different restaurants and grocery stores. When they have to ship that across country, they often pack it in sphagnum peat moss to keep the human pathogens. First of all, so the food won't spoil, and that there will be no human pathogens lurking on that food during shipment. So lots and lots of uses. And it's a really cool plant. It is impressive in bog environments. If you ever get to go walk on a sphagnum mat, if it's thick enough, you can walk out on it, and it's over the water of the bog. You can feel it undulating underneath you, and hopefully you won't fall through. So I think some of Dr. Verdes' students have accidentally fallen through over the years. And then I know that there have been some students on a hot day, they purposely fall through just so that they cool off in the boggy water. But really cool environments. Bogs are a fascinating environment, and there's a lot of bogs in this area, in this latitude and further north. So really cool systems. This poor soul was found in a bog. This corpse is actually 2,000 years old. When they uncovered it, this is what it looks like. This is a 2,000-year-old body, and look how preserved it is. It should just be bones. So that's how antiseptic peat bogs are. It stopped the microbes from decaying down the tissue of the person after death. So that's pretty amazing. That's quite the testament to how antiseptic the peat bogs can be. Harvesting, again, it is controversial, but it is something that is still currently being done for a lot of reasons, including, adding it into potting soil and being sold that way. You can also burn it, believe it or not. I don't really ever see bags of peat for sale around here for burning, but I know it's a thing in other countries. And I put down in the notes, that it puts out the same heat output as coal and burns just as long while giving off a unique comforting aroma and leaves no black soot, leaving chimneys and fire burns cleaner for longer. And so last I looked for it on Amazon years ago, and they did have it for sale. And then I looked again fairly recently, and they don't. So I don't know if that's because they're starting to phase that out in general, like globally. Does anyone know? I haven't kept up in the peat world, but I know that like over in Finland, when I visited over there, my cousins in Finland, they have a lot of peat bogs there too. So this is a very, it's a topic for lots of conversation and concerns, and it's kind of in front of people who live, especially further north, where has been an industry, and now the question is, should it continue to be an industry? By the way, peat moss, they're starting to look at like coconut, the leftover parts of the coconut fruit. It's called coconut coir. Can't say the word very well. COIR, as a replacement, but that's pretty expensive right now too. But it's like a waste product from coconut harvesting, so it's a nice idea. But right now it's still pretty expensive. So hopefully that will, and they're continuing to look for other like biodegradable options besides peat moss. And if you're over 21 and have tasted that really kind of smoky flavored whiskey, they actually use sphagnum peat moss for that. So they dry the peat moss and they burn it. And then, you know, so they're creating a fire with smoke. And then what they do is they spread the barley seeds over that. And then the seeds soak up that smoky flavor. And then they use that when they ferment and make whiskey from the barley seed. So it is still done that way. And so this, I can't remember how to pronounce that word, but that's a famous, so I have it in the notes on how to pronounce it. Somewhere, someone told me how to pronounce it at one point. Does anyone know? Oh, Laphroaig. There it is. Laphroaig is how you pronounce that business. But anyways, big business, probably million. I don't know if it's $1 billion business, but I'm sure it's $1 million business to do this type of whiskey. They're not the only company that does this. There's a lot of different whiskey brands out there. So that's big business too. Okay, so lots of uses for especially sphagnum moss. And then of course, just mosses in general are decorative. A lot of people use them like in terrariums and things like that. So don't forget just the attraction of how they look. So we talked about liverworts a little bit on Monday, that you can have the so-called leafy versus fallow. So this, we've already gone over this, so I'm going through it very quickly. Okay, so we talked about the idea of leafy versus fallow, and they tend to be happy in pretty wet areas, more so than mosses. Mosses get a little like, I'm too wet, and liverworts are like, I'm just fine. So they're found in more wet habitats. And then we looked at the leafy versus fallows. You know, what do they look like with the naked eye? And looking at, the splash cups, we looked at those a little bit. Were there any splash cups? Oh, good. And those are always so fun to look at. And then, of course, hunting for the little pieces of tissue, which are called gemma. And then the splash cups are called gemma cups. But anyways, it's a nice, fun thing to look for when I try to always remember to bring a hand lens with me when I'm out hiking, because the bryophytes can be fun to look at when you have time. And then we talked about Reishi being used in aquaria. That's actually very, very common. So I was doing some searching for, bryophyte uses, commercial or economic importance. Here is a liverwort that produces psychoactive cannabinoids, and it's legal. So this is sold and it's legal to purchase, no problem. And so they're looking at, it's a radula species that this paper is talking. So that has grabbed the attention of a lot of scientists, looking at, how similar is it to, in this case, it's very similar to THC in terms of its chemical structure. You may have heard of Dr. Wilson has been doing work here at NMU in the chemistry department with liverworts. So that's him on the left there in the back. That's Dr. Wilson and Matt Jennings, I think, where they were presenting their research to the Board of Control here, or Board of Trustees, I think is the way we talk about it now. So the Board of Trustees, and they were talking about this particular radula complanata liverwort. And so this is a blurb from the news write-up on the Board of Trustees meeting. And so they were looking at this one for brain tumor impact. Okay, so not a cannabinoid, it's a brain tumor idea, that their extracts from liverwort are actually inhibiting brain tumor cells. And so, of course, that's a pretty big deal. You may or may not know that we have a brain tumor research center here on campus. And so the UNT Upper Michigan Brain Tumor. And so Dr. Wynn, who is our dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, he runs that program. And so he's doing work with Dr. Wilson and other people involved. So that would be, as you can imagine, pretty huge if they are able to continue this research on that, narrow down that extra power, and then could they be something that could be safely used in brain tumor reduction. Really exciting work, and hopefully it will grow into something that's going to be effective. Okay, so liverworts are gaining some pretty good attention because of some of their wide uses. Hornworts, we mentioned just briefly on Monday. This is the smallest group. There's not many of them left anymore. Most of them have gone extinct. About 100 species left. And Anthoceras is a genus. You can find that around here. Temperate is this area of the world. So you can find them around here if you look carefully. And so if they have that horn, so to speak, that horn sticking up off the body of the liverwort, that usually means that they're getting ready to release their spores. So the spores are being formed inside of that whole length of the hornwort. And then that just splits kind of right in half and kind of peels apart. The two parts peel apart and the spores get released. So they do things a little differently in that regard, but it's effective. So that's how they would look. Very petite though, so you'd have to look very carefully when you're out hiking for this, in a really consistently moist area. So in general, when I was doing some looking at the bryophytes, like all of them, like mosses, liverworts, hornworts, that whole group, what's going on out there? And like I said, they're gaining attention. So initially, a lot of research in drug discovery, the angiosperms are the golden child. Like everyone seems to have focused on them first, which rightly so. Angiosperms, the flowering plants, are amazing in their ability to produce all kinds of really interesting chemicals that we can take advantage of. But now, fairly recently, they're starting to go, oh, wait a minute, angiosperms aren't the only gene in town, and that there are other groups of plants that we should be considering. And so this paper is kind of putting out that plea that, we should look at other things. There's other opportunities out there. Bryophytes have been mostly overlooked, potentially due to their seemingly tiny, simple, and obscure nature. So the fact that they're tiny and they seem rather basic in their overall function and anatomy kind of made the scientists dismiss them out of hand. But they're finding lots of interesting chemicals, and so they're looking at the idea of mining the bryophytes to see what they got and what kinds of chemicals are they using. And the other thing too, the fact that they do live, often when you go to plants that live in distinct or harsh habitats, you really kind of hit a gold mine of interesting chemicals that those plants are making in order to survive in those habitats. So that's actually a really good strategy. If you could go to kind of pretty unique, unusual, harsh habitats, that's a good way to hunt for the different drugs that the plants are making. So the more they look, the more they find. And so the scientists that are, like Dr. Wilson, that are interested in bryophytes, it's worth pursuing to continue this, because they're now, with the technology we have available for different extraction techniques and assessing what they're making, it makes it go that much faster. So I think it's just really a great time to be involved in botany, the botany world, whether it be for a job or research purposes or whatever, because the technology has really allowed us to really dig into exploring, what the plants are doing. Here's another paper that was published. So this one was published just last year. This is the abstract from the paper. And again, looking at secondary metabolites. So anytime you see that word, So like we have primary metabolites and secondary metabolites. Okay, so we do this too. It's not just plants. So primary metabolites in plants are like the ordinary metabolites that they use every minute to stay alive. Like they have to, use sugars to make their ATP, just like when you eat, that all gets processed into your cells to make ATP. And so those are primary metabolites. Secondary metabolites for plants, those are metabolites that they don't always make on a minute to minute or day to day basis. Secondary metabolites are made typically in response to some environmental stimuli. And that could, it's usually if they're getting attacked by some other organism and they're trying to defend themselves. Then they start ramping up certain key secondary metabolites to defend themselves, stay alive and intact and healthy. And so secondary metabolites, usually when you hear that, you're thinking about drug discovery and some, because a lot of these secondary metabolites are chemicals that we find can be useful in human medicine, animal medicine in general, but also good for our diet. So like when you hear about polyphenols being produced by the plant, those are secondary metabolites, and they're really good for our diet. And so there's this huge interest from several different angles about secondary metabolites in plants because there's so many uses for humans. So, so I'm not going to read this out to you right now. This is something you can read at your study. But again, basically in a big nutshell, is just saying that we shouldn't overlook them anymore. They need to be investigated for their potential. Any questions on the bryophytes? Okay, well, the other slide set that I'd like you to pull up if you're following along is the seedless vascular plants. That's the other group I wanted to finish talking about. So I think I mentioned on Monday, when you're studying the land plants now, so the bryophytes, the seedless vascular plants, eventually we'll get into gymnosperms and then the angiosperms. So as you're studying them, also think about what makes them similar to each other and different from each other, okay? And the reason I ask you to do that is that helps show kind of their evolutionary trajectory on Earth. So the bryophytes are the most primitive. They evolved, a very petite body with no vascular system. Now with the seedless vascular plant, they evolved the ability to have vascular tissue, which allowed them to be more successful in some ways than bryophytes because now they can get into drier habitats as long as the soil system that they are getting their water from, has enough water. And so it is actually a pretty good strategy to dominate the drier habitats compared to bryophytes that are pretty limited mostly into more consistently moist habitats. There's some exceptions, but in general. So you're looking at representatives of the 4 different groups, phyla. And so here you have the club mosses up top. We have plenty of those around. If you just look around and on the ground when you're out hiking in the woods, they're all over the place. Whisk ferns you won't find, but they're a very interesting of the seedless vascular plants. They're the most primitive for sure. And then we have the horsetail on the lower left and the ferns on the lower right. So we talked about how we have the idea of, this was on Monday, where we looked at the xylem, having the tracheids now for xylem tissue and the sieve cells for phloem. That's the more primitive types of xylem and phloem. They still need free water. for fertilization like the bryophyte. And like the bryophytes, they have chlorophyll A and B, they have carotenoids, bryophytes have that too. They store starch, long-term carb storage, carbohydrate storage is starch for the most part. And they definitely have cell walls that have plenty of cellulose. So that's all similar to bryophytes. And then we still see that there's spores being produced. So the bryophytes produce spores too, that they release out to their environment to colonize new land. The seedless vascular plants do that too, but they tend to cluster all the spore areas into one physical location. And so we call that a strobulus. And so when you look at a strobulus, it's just clusters of sporangia. And remember, sporangia are like sac-like pieces of tissue that when you crack them open and look inside, that's where the spores are. Right? So the sporangium kind of houses the spores. It's a house for the spores. And if you put all those together real tightly packed, then we start calling it a strobulus. Okay? So a lot of the seedless vascular plants use that strategy, and they actually think that it was like a stab at something similar to a flower that you see with the angiosperms. Okay? So they often say it was the forerunner of the flower. So here you can see some strobili. The club moss is on the left. You can clearly see that tightly packed leaves here and sporangia tissue. So you would need a hand lens and a microscope to actually, zoom in on the spores inside here, but they're there. And then the horsetails on the right, they have pretty distinct, kind of funky looking strobili, a little bit more complicated looking compared to the club moss, but it's the same basic idea. Clusters of sporangia, and inside all those sporangia are a bunch of spores that will eventually get released. Okay, so I think this is new, the words anyways, this is new material. All right, so the phylum, oh, by the way, the bryophyte slide set, I updated it again because I realized I did not put the phylum name. So I did that. So please, so like phylum Bryophyta or the mosses. So please make sure when you are looking at the slide set that you're paying attention to phylum names, because I'll be asking for that. Like on the example, I say the club mosses belong to what phylum, and I'll list out their phylum. Okay, so please start committing those to memory. Flashcards might be a good way to. So I call them club mosses. A lot of people call them brown pines, but they look like little pine trees sometimes. And then the genus is Lycopodium. Spike mosses are another group in the phylum. Quillworts are the third. So I'll show you examples of those. You're probably most familiar with club mosses, I would guess. Hey, did the resurrection plant work when you put it into water? Was it starting to uncurl, hopefully? You see some nod. That's good. All right, so the image you're looking at on this slide is club mosses with some very ready to go strobili there. Those spores are ready to get released. So a lot of the species within this phylum are tropical, but having said that, we do have a fair bit here. A lot of them are epiphytes, which means that, especially in the tropics, they like to hang out on tree branches. They're not hurting the trees, they're just hanging out on them and using them as support and ways to get higher up to get access to sunlight. But you can find them in more harsh habitats like the Arctic. Here in temperate forests like we have here, they are on the ground, forest floor, and they're evergreen. So if there's not, if the snow isn't too deep, you can see patches of evergreen club mosses. It's a welcome sight in the middle of winter. They also form mycorrhizal relationships with fungi, just like the bryophytes do, very similar idea. And again, a lot of this phylum, they have some version of a strobulus to house their spores. Okay, so look for them when you're out hiking around. They don't get really big around here, but I guess in tropical areas, they can get decent sized. So Here, that's why they call them ground pines, because this species does look like a little miniature Christmas tree almost. And so the ground pine idea. Spike mosses are another group in this phylum, and they actually, you'll see them a fair bit being sold in florists or flower shops, plant shops, because they make nice house plants as long as you have not terrible humidity. You need some level of humidity, but there's lots of different colors. People landscape with them as well, if they can handle the year-round temperatures. And then the resurrection, you played around with hopefully in lab a little bit. This one, again, they're really intensely studying it because of its ability to just go super dry, hang out for years in that way, and then get resuscitated, so to speak, when you stick them in some water. So really a remarkable plant. And again, they're very interested now in looking at the genetics, finding the genes that allow for this. Can we create, modify plants that might have these traits? And then the quillworts are pretty simple. They're often in shallow water or along the bank of rivers. Isoetes is how you say that. I say that genus name, Isoetes. And so quillworts, you can see why they're called quillworts. Very much like porcupine quills. And then this phylum, so I put the phylum first because you're probably not familiar with pugmosses. The phylum Psilotophyta, anytime you see PS like that, P with a consonant in science, the P is usually silent. So it's Psilotophyta, that's how it's pronounced. And so again, whisk ferns really kind of weird looking and pretty, well, the most primitive of all of the seedless vascular plants. Not many left. Most of them have gone extinct. There's 2 genera, Psilotum, that genus, and then again, the T in front of another consonant in science is silent. So that second genus word, you just say Mesipterus, Mesipterus. So there's only 2 left. All the rest have gone extinct. So there's really not that many left in the world. And you can't find them around here. They're tropical and subtropical. They like to hang out on tree branches. They're the most primitive because they do not have roots or leaves. They're just stems. That's all they are. And then some sporangia tissue. And so they're pretty basic. So the stems do all the work in terms of being photosynthetic. But believe it or not, they have underground stems called rhizomes. So these rhizomes are stem tissue underground. Many plants that have rhizomes. And it's the stem tissue that actually the fungus will associate with. So you don't always have to have roots or fungus to be happy with the plant. So it's kind of fun to think about these fungi, or they adapt and they can hang out with stem tissue as well as root tissue. Here's a close-up of the stem with the sporangia. So on the left, you can see that they're like, I'll say it's a pumpkin. So sporangia, clusters, pumpkin. And then when it rises up, it goes yellowish orange like that. And then those will split open and spill out all the spores eventually. And then Mesipterus loves to be epiphytic on tree trunks and tree branches. And this one doesn't look so branch-like. It has a little bit more leaf-like look to it, but those aren't true leaves. Okay, they're not true leaves. Okay, we'll stop there and get into horsetails on Friday, and we'll probably also start getting into gymnosperms on Friday.